Good morning and thank you for joining our webinar this morning. We have John Wilkins here from Bytes and Chris De Vere from VMware who will be going through the webinar with you. I'm now going to pass you over to John from Bytes.
Hi, morning everyone. As you're probably all aware, VMware are a long-standing Tier 1 vendor for Bytes, and we have their top level of accreditations here. Chris, who will be presenting from VMware, has got a huge amount of experience in this field, and he covers the subject matter in a very clear to understand and enjoyable manner, so it should be a good webinar to see. The vCHS hybrid cloud, it's having an unprecedented take-up within our customer base and the marketplace in general at the moment. So this topic is very hot and has huge relevance right now. It's the best fit cloud solution for the majority of our customers as it's running on vSphere, which is identical to their own data centers. So I'm now going to hand over to Chris and take it away.
Okay, so I'm Chris De Vere from VMware. Let me just talk you through over the next few minutes about vCHS, which stands for vCloud Hybrid Service, which is VMware's entry into the cloud business, the infrastructure as a service cloud business. So let me just explain where we've come from with this. Just hold on a second. Okay, that's better. So if you look in the bottom left-hand corner of this slide, which I've got up now, you can see that 8 years ago, Amazon introduced Elastic Cloud Compute, EC2, and it introduced S2 storage 8 years ago. So effectively, Amazon really invented this infrastructure as a service market, and have done a brilliant job since then. Fairly shortly afterwards, a new man took over at VMware called Paul Maritz, and he laid down the strategy for VMware's cloud. And what he said was that VMware is strong in the hypervisor, but the hypervisor, though it's necessary for cloud, by itself it isn't cloud. So what he said, which was probably not rocket science, was that VMware was in a unique position to be able to build tools on top of the hypervisor to allow customers to deliver private clouds within their own environments. And indeed, we've been working along that path for the last 6 years, and now that's manifesting itself in what we call the software-defined data center. But what was cleverer in terms of Paul Maritz's strategy was he said, look, what if we could persuade people who wanted to build their own clouds to build their clouds on the same platform as people are using internally? Then what that would mean would be that customers could logically extend their IT environments from their on-premises environment, grab some cloud in one of the public service providers' clouds, and they would be able to see that as a logical extension of their own environment, or they should be able to treat it as that. And some of the key aspects, with this would be that workload would be able to move from one of these environments to the other and back again without any conversion. And importantly, the IT department would be able to have all the benefits of a private cloud with the elasticity of a public cloud as well. So VMware has worked with service providers to build these clouds, and VMware has now decided to become one of these service provider cloud providers with vCHS. And I'll explain a little bit more about this. So that effectively is a strategy that we've been working on, not just suddenly, but we've been working on really for the last 6 years, almost as long really as Amazon has been in the public cloud space. So the key issue here, really, the key difference between this approach and what Amazon is doing, and again, this is not meant to be a criticism of Amazon. Amazon is great if you really wanted to build something and perhaps start off in Amazon, if you're building the next Facebook or you're building the next Netflix or something like that. But if you wanted to move workload from on-premises on a VMware environment into Amazon, you would have to convert that workload. And likewise, if you wanted to bring the workload back again, you'd have to convert the workload to bring it back on premises. And as you probably realize, every time you convert software, something may not go quite right. And so there is some risk associated with doing that. So as the VMware platforms are absolutely identical, there isn't this requirement to convert workload in a VMware-based environment. So that's really where VMware was coming from, and really this is, in the green box below, this is really the key essence of what VMware's cloud story is about. It's about being able to manage some resource in those public clouds really as if it is a logical extension of an organization's internal IT infrastructure. So importantly, the same security tools, the firewalls and the VPNs and the NAT addressing and things like that, the same policies, the same management, one could call the same application, call the same help desk, and importantly, the same applications, as I mentioned before, can move between these environments. So the story for VMware's or VMware's cloud story is effectively different to that of AWS and of Microsoft Azure, and indeed of people like Google Cloud as well. So it's really about being compatible with an on-premises environment. So why do we think this may be of value? Well, there's probably a number of reasons. Agility and cost and compliance being some of those. So just looking at the issue of agility, I mean, quite often when we talk to customers and we talk to IT organizations and other parts of our customer organizations, what they say is that when a customer requests some resource, the time it takes before that user is able to actually sit down and log on can easily be weeks or months, particularly if there's some sort of procurement process in the middle of that. And one of the surprising things that we found is that quite often these steps are put in, the approvals and the change management and so on, are steps put in quite often to slow down the sprawl of physical hardware. So they don't necessarily fit that well with the kind of cloud, in the world of cloud. So the question would be, if it currently takes weeks or months to make more IT resource available, what would it mean to an IT organization and indeed the businesses that they are serving if some IT resource could be made available not in weeks or months, but in a few hours? So one of the first customers we had was a consulting company, and what that consulting company wanted to be able to do was that as soon as it won a contract from a customer, from a client, it wanted to set up the IT environment for that customer, that joint environment, on the same day that they won the contract, to give the customer the impression that they'd started work straight away, and importantly, at the end of the contract, they knew that they could bring that workload back into their premises or indeed move it to the customer without having to do any kind of conversions. The second issue is to do with cost. Now, at VMware, and if you're familiar with VMware over the last few years, you know we've been talking about the kind of road to 100% virtualization. We quite often ask, are you 50% virtualized, or are you 60% virtualized, and this kind of thing, as if 100% virtualization is the kind of nirvana. Now, on the whole, that's a great place to be, but if a customer is building its environment to its peak workloads, and its peak workloads are substantially higher than its steady-state environment, then it still means that even if one is 100% virtualized, one could still be running at less than 100% IT utilization, simply because one has to build for these peak workloads. So in this example here, for instance, if one was building for the peak workload and the steady state was at 50% of that, even if one had 100% virtualization, one would still be running at 50% utilization. So the question would be, what if one could build one's infrastructure to one's steady-state environments and effectively use something like a hybrid cloud to be able to handle these peaks? What would that mean in terms of cost savings if one had to have so many fewer racks, indeed potentially so many fewer data centers, even in some cases? So potentially we could be talking about hundreds of thousands, potentially millions, or in some cases tens of millions of pounds per year savings if one didn't have to build for these kind of peak environments. Now, sometimes, I mean, this is one survey of indeed hundreds, and they all come out with the same sort of results. why people aren't moving to the cloud, and indeed there is a move towards it, but the main objections are always around security, integration with back-end IT, how they can bring information, the data back, regulatory requirements and things like that. Those tend to be the kind of objections or the roadblocks towards moving towards the cloud. So on the whole, with the VMware vCHS hybrid cloud, on the whole, the grabbing of some additional resource within vCHS looks almost like having another internal data center to the IT organization. So as far as IT is concerned, grabbing a chunk of vCHS looks as though it's just simply managing another internal data center, and certainly that's how it will look on the dashboards one's using. One can use the same tools that one's currently using for the internal environment, same firewalls, same policies, that kind of thing. So those are some of the advantages. So just moving forward then to what the vCHS environment is. So you can see at the top left, it's a cloud service which is owned and operated by VMware. It will be sold through our partners such as Bytes in the same way as we sell our current products, and we intend to hold the data in country, whichever countries we're in. So we have some data centers, as I'll show you, in the UK. The data will be held in the UK, not in any other country, such as Ireland or the US. And the part in the middle here in blue about license portability, with some caveats, people like Microsoft and Citrix and so on agree that one can move one's licenses that they've purchased for on-premises into the hybrid cloud. Now, there are some caveats associated with all of these. Bytes is particularly strong in this area, and indeed would be able to advise, what conditions one can move licenses into the hybrid cloud, and what aspects of one's licenses would prevent that. But on the whole, Microsoft is supportive of being able to move licenses into the hybrid cloud. So with that, then let me just step forward and explain what it is that we have. So at the moment, as far as infrastructure as a service is concerned, VMware has two flavors of a capacity offering, and we are not selling individual VMs in the way that Amazon does. So if we come back to the thought that really this is a logical extension of an IT environment, what VMware is providing is, again, are chunks of resource which the IT organization would be managing. So there are two offerings at the moment, two SKUs. There is a dedicated cloud platform and a virtual private cloud platform. The dedicated cloud platform is dedicated in the terms of having a dedicated CPU and RAM. Effectively, one gets a dedicated blade. Storage is shared, and indeed bandwidth and IP addresses are shared. The virtual private cloud is a pure multi-tenanted platform. So if you can see with these chunks here, the first thing is that there is a commitment period of at least a month, and one could have a commitment period of up to 3 years if one wanted to. And then one takes chunks of this resource, and that this color coding here, red, blue, yellow, and green, are amounts of resource that can be scaled independently. So if you wanted more CPU and RAM, more storage, more bandwidth, indeed more IP addresses, you could have more of those independently of the other components. So one's buying a chunk of resource, either dedicated or multi-tenanted with a virtual private cloud. The SKU is slightly smaller for virtual private cloud. And one would tend to use a dedicated SKU for things like, particularly for some licensing issues. So Oracle, for instance, will not allow customers to run on a multi-tenanted environment, so one would have to have a dedicated SKU for that. And likewise, Microsoft desktop licenses can only be run on a dedicated environment for licensing reasons. So these are two chunks of resource here, and Bytes can help further if you wanted to have that tailored for your own environment. Now, importantly, at the bottom here, you can see that firewalls, VPNs, load balancers, disk I/O, HA, DHCP, and NATs, NAT addressing, there is no additional charge for these as there are on most other cloud environments. Importantly, there's no charge for disk I/O, which is something indeed that Amazon does charge for, so it's a bit of a surprise at the end of each month when one gets an additional charge. Importantly, there is no, this platform is a highly available platform because it's a VMware platform, and VMware makes no additional charge for that. So for other environments, one would tend to have to build one's own high availability into that. So in Amazon, if you wanted high availability, you'd have to build that across a number of availability zones, and this wouldn't be a trivial thing to do. So one would probably have to employ a consultant or something like that. So it's a slightly different focus. We're focusing really at enterprise customers. Amazon was probably focusing at the kind of developer or someone getting up and going. Certainly originally that was the case for them. So quite often at this stage people ask me, how do we compare cost-wise with Amazon? So as I go through this, you'll see that really we're aiming at different markets, but still Amazon is the market leader, by far. To give you a rough idea, because we did a comparison for our customer, without high availability, we're probably about 20 to 25% more expensive than Amazon, just for pure compute. If you build in HA, Amazon is probably about 40% more expensive than us, just as a rough comparison. And that includes the kind of price reductions that we've been through recently. So that just gives you some sort of a feel. So fairly similar. One would connect to this cloud typically over a secure IPsec or SSL VPN connection. So one would use the internet to connect to this. And the dedicated cloud, one would connect to typically with a 10 megabit per second connection, and a virtual private cloud, a dedicated cloud with a 50 megabit per second connection, and virtual private cloud 10 megabit per second connection. One can also have a dedicated environment, a dedicated line, so one could have a higher bandwidth connection into this data center, and one could choose a telco provider of choice to provide this dedicated line into the data center. So one could have 10 gigabit or typically 1 gigabit connections. Because both of these environments, the environment in the vCloud hybrid service and also typically what people are using on premises, are VMware environments, the same tools could be used for managing both environments. So the vSphere client can be used to manage both environments. If one's using vCenter operations, you would just see some additional resource that vCenter operations will be monitoring. vCloud Automation Center could be the interface to this, as indeed to other clouds if you're using that as well. So importantly, the same tools would work on premises as would work with vCHS. And we have to say this because sometimes we create the impression that one has to have built a private cloud before you can actually connect to vCHS. That's not the case. If you wanted to build a hybrid cloud, you could do so, and all you need is vSphere if you wanted to be able to do that. So you just need to have the pure hypervisor, and you can grab some more resource in the cloud. So the more tools you have on premises, the easier it is to manage it, but you don't have to have done that first. And indeed, if you have no on-premises and you wanted just to start in the cloud like Amazon, all you would need is a web browser to get going with that. So, so where are we? So we have a number of sites in the States. We have 4 at the moment in the USA. There's 2 more that's about to open. We have 1 in the UK at the moment, which is in Equinix in Slough. And we have a second one opening at Digital Realty in Chessington, which will be open in July. So those 2 are in the UK, which are relevant for us here. And later on this year, we expect to have Germany and France built out as well, some presence in Germany and France. And again, where we have these data centers, we will keep the data in those countries. Outside Europe, we expect to have in Asia Pacific, just as a matter of interest, Singapore, Australia, and Japan within 2014. So we started off with two infrastructure as a service offerings, the dedicated cloud, as I mentioned, and the virtual private cloud. And we've just introduced the first of a number of disaster recovery as a service offerings. This first one that we have is based on vSphere replication. So any of you who are familiar with vSphere replication will understand how this works. So this is the replicating of VMs from one environment to another. In this case, it would be from on-premises to the DR instance of vCHS in the cloud. What's known as the recovery point objective, in other words, the gap between taking a copy and in other words, how long the gap may be if you had a failure, that could be as low as 15 minutes. And that really depends on the amount of bandwidth that there is coming from the customer site into vCHS, but it could be low as 15 minutes, and the recovery time objective should be significantly less than 4 hours. So this is designed for not to replace things like Site Recovery Manager or other synchronous replicating synchronous disaster recovery solutions. This is really designed more for those environments which don't have DR at the moment, maybe just backup or something like that. As you can see at the bottom here, this includes 2 tests a year, 2 7-day DR tests a year, and also included in the price is that if there was a recovery, one would be able to run for 30 days for no additional charge. And indeed, if you ran over 30 days, then there would be some charge applied to running that environment in the kind of DR mode. So it's simple to use. So the idea is that the customer would be able to choose the VMs that he would want to have replicated, and would be able to instigate the recovery fairly easily as well. So it's simple to use. A recovery as a service is how some people have positioned it. So at the top there, you can top right, you can see we've got the dedicated and virtual private instance, and we now have this DR instance as an additional offering. It's sold in terabyte increments, terabytes of disaster recovery capacity, and for that cost, so for a terabyte of resource, the cost is about £500 per month. So it is a relatively cost-effective solution for those workloads that probably don't have DR at the moment. This is how, indeed, there are some add-ons here if one wanted to have those. So if one did fail over and found one needed more storage or more compute, one can certainly purchase those. This is what a colleague of mine put up, and I thought that was quite interesting, and that was that the red line indicates the importance of the applications perhaps in an organization. Typically, one would have some sort of disaster recovery for a number of the most critical ones, and the rest of the apps either have some sort of backup, possibly they have some sort of on-site replication, perhaps some of those have pretty much nothing. And one would tend to do these things because perhaps for auditing reasons one needs to have had the most critical applications with some sort of cover. But one of the questions really would be, how long could one survive realistically with just these apps running without all the ancillary apps that are running as well? So one of the kind of stories that we're trying to put forward is that this kind of replication could possibly give something like disaster recovery or business continuity to the cloud for something like the cost of the price of backup as well. And I mentioned here Metcalfe's law. Some of you may know what that is. So Metcalfe was the person who invented Ethernet. He said that the value of a network is roughly proportional to the number of nodes on that network squared. So one could argue in the same sort of thing that all the nodes or the apps in an organization, the value of business continuity is roughly proportional to the number of apps that you're able to provide some sort of disaster recovery for. So this really here, the area where the apps just have backup or some sort of on-site replication or indeed nothing at all, that's really where this solution, this disaster recovery solution is designed to fit. And indeed, there is much more coming, actually, as far as disaster recovery is concerned over the next year and a half, incidentally. Okay, so I'll just touch on platform as a service, which that was announced at EMC World last week. So we've talked about infrastructure as a service. We are introducing a platform as a service, which is going to be coming out shortly. I was surprised to see this picture a few months ago that someone gave us in his presentation, and I thought, gosh, I saw this 25 years ago. In case you haven't seen it, this is what the customer described. So he didn't describe it very well in terms of what he wanted. This is how the project leader understood the requirements to be. This is how the analyst spec'd it. This is how the programmer wrote the code. This is what the salesman pictured it would look like. This is the kind of documentation here. This is as far as operations went installing it. This is what the customer was charged for. And this is how it was supported, and indeed this is really all that the customer wanted. So the reason I put this up here is that it takes a long time to develop software, really, is what this still shows after 25 years. And what I'm trying, that really is a preamble to where this kind of PaaS fits. So as you may or may not know, the platform as a service is a kind of development environment as well as a kind of runtime environment, and some of the value of something like a PaaS comes from speeding up the development, and part of that speeding up and the kind of reliability of the development. So typically one has a number of steps to go through in this kind of development phase, here a number of testing phases. One of the big advantages with a PaaS is that typically one has to set up these WebSphere, these web app and database layers for each of these testing cycles, and with a PaaS, one hasn't got to do that because it's the same environment. So one of the problems with setting up each of these environments is, first of all, it takes time. Secondly, each of these may be subtly different from each other, which may mean that the testing isn't quite as rigorous as it should be. The advantage with with a PaaS is that, first of all, the developer hasn't got to code or have any understanding of the different layers that he's coding to, and secondly, that the testing should be more rigorous and quicker because one doesn't need to kind of set up the different test environments for each of these environments. So that's really what some of the value of this PaaS environment is to development organizations within enterprises. One of the other things to do with so certainly one of the key mantras now is all about agile development and continuous development, and these are various books that are out about that. There are other PaaS platforms out there. Heroku, Azure, Google App Engine are well-known PaaSes. I've put this picture up here, which a colleague of mine said when he typed into his spell checker Heroku, the spell checker came up with heroin. And the reason that that's kind of amusing to developers is that most of these PaaSes will try and lock you into their environment so that they've really got kind of ongoing business. They won't force you to be locked in, but they'll offer you their own databases, they'll offer you their own queuing system and things like that. So the thing about Cloud Foundry is that it's an open source environment, so it means that if the operating system of the cloud is the PaaS layer, then really you don't want to be locked into that, because we've already been through that with IBM with the mainframe and really with Microsoft with the desktop, and so really it would be silly to be locked in for a third time. So the quickest way I think to understand Cloud Foundry and the PaaSes in general, but certainly Cloud Foundry, is a real case with Comic Relief. Comic Relief was paying $500,000 a year to Oracle to run its software. They redeveloped the same sort of application or the same capability in 4 months with 4 developers. They developed it in Cloud Foundry and deployed it on Cloud Foundry. Cloud Foundry runs on a number of clouds, so it has this kind of this ability for resilience across a number of clouds. And importantly, so the number of clouds gave it the resilience, and the development and platform gave them the speed to be able to do this. So, and that's something that they did 2 years ago. So for the last 2 Comic Reliefs, Comic Relief and Sport Relief, both of those have run on some application that's been developed and run on Cloud Foundry. Okay, so when we go back to talking about vCHS generally, what we say is that we think there's a number of areas where we think this is good. So certainly dev and test is certainly an important area. Packaged applications, because by default they'll all work on this, work on vCHS. Disaster recovery, the first of those capabilities is here. The next generation apps really is here on the right, is more to do with Cloud Foundry, and certainly people can still develop new applications in Java or .NET or whatever they want to in vCHS. So, so we've touched on some of the things that we've got. So but there are more things coming. So disaster recovery, we've touched on that a little bit. The first element's here now, as I mentioned, but there is more to come, and it will move more to sort of site recovery manager-like capability, but that's probably about 1.5 years away. We will have a desktop as a service coming in the 3rd quarter, and likewise there will be some sort of database as a service, probably SQL Server and MySQL being the first. There'll be some object storage coming, PCI compliance coming, and some sort of ISV application catalog, the first elements of which are already in place. So you'll be able to see here that the bottom level, the infrastructure as a service, we've already started to build out. Again, there'll be more things coming here, such as a database layer and other things like that. We've got the PaaS layer coming in Q3 shortly, already been announced. There will be desktop as a service and this catalog that I mentioned building out as well. So there'll be quite a lot coming as far as vCHS is concerned. So quite often then people say to me, where does vCHS fit relative to the other cloud vendors that are out there, particularly AWS, but clearly Microsoft has Microsoft Azure. Google has Google Cloud now, so it's we certainly expect to see more from them as we move forward. So this slide that I'm going to show you is something that a colleague of mine, Massimo Rifera in Italy, put together actually. This vertical line indicates the difference between the new world, if you like, for want of a better term, the next generation apps where the resilience is perhaps designed into the software, and the world of traditional apps, of enterprise apps, where of Microsoft, of Oracle, and things like that. Now, AWS has done a brilliant job. We don't know exactly how big AWS is, how big it is, because AWS doesn't split out the cloud part of its business. But it's somewhere between 1.5 billion and 3 billion, we think. And so it's done pretty well to have grown to that size in 8 years. And not surprisingly, AWS as a cloud is really designed for the new world, for the Zingers and the Netflixes and people like that. AWS is coming back more into the kind of enterprise world, trying to look at that as well, incidentally. Azure, perhaps surprisingly, coming from Microsoft, is also focused primarily in this new world, and indeed Google is as well. Google is probably aiming more at big data at the moment in this kind of cloud space. vCHS is really targeted at the old world at the moment. So kind of unashamedly, vCHS is targeted at the old world, and the reason being that though Amazon has done a brilliant job, and Amazon's really by far the biggest player here, the amount of business that's in the cloud is still small relative to traditional workloads. So there's probably about 4 trillion worth of traditional business out of here. Most of this still requires some of the kind of value that a hybrid cloud could offer them. So vCHS really is targeting itself at this kind of business. So the problem that traditional IT has. Over time, vCHS will move to the right, and you've seen some aspects of that with Cloud Foundry that I've just talked through, and also with other products that we'll have coming along shortly in that space. So that's a kind of rough picture in terms of where we fit relative to some of the other big cloud vendors. So we're not, most of the others really are aiming at the new world. We perhaps slightly strangely are, well, not strangely because that's where the business is, we are focusing really at the traditional world, old world if you'd like to call it that. Okay, so this is just kind of confirmation of that. So there are sort of 90 operating systems on the right which VMware supports. In fact, there's only 45 they've listed up here, which I counted. Interestingly, we support more Windows, Microsoft operating systems than Microsoft does itself. So you can see that as far as applications are concerned and operating systems, VMware is the sweet spot for VMware is running traditional workloads and those applications that currently exist. So with that, then really I wanted to just step through where just to recap in terms of where the value is. So one of the values we think for traditional IT again is the ability to deliver some resource within hours rather than weeks. So an IT organization can expand its environment within a few hours rather than perhaps weeks or months. And that should be able to offer some value to an IT organization because it means that they can respond much quicker to their customers, their business customers' needs. Longer term, and again, we're not expecting people to do this immediately, but longer term, there could be some sort of a plan where one builds to one steady state, and those kind of peaks can be handled by vCHS. Indeed, if one didn't want to put one's most critical workload in vCHS initially, one could still put one's less critical workload into vCHS and free up more resource on premises for the critical applications that needed to address that peak workload. So there is a significant cost-saving story that could be put forward, and many of the people on this call may have already made good careers out of the cost savings that VMware has been able to deliver to organizations so far. This in some way is a continuation of that same story. And really there's this issue that as far as compliance and audits are concerned, I mean, it's not, perhaps saying it's just another internal data center, maybe a little bit too trite, but it's very close to looking just like another internal data center as far as, auditors and compliance is concerned. So, and in addition, we have this disaster recovery capability, which is available now, this vSphere replication-based disaster recovery, designed to really replace, designed for workloads that don't currently have a disaster recovery capability today. So with that, I think I'm just about a minute or two ahead of the 40 minutes or so that we plan to run through this. So with that, I'd like to hand back to John and to Amy, and indeed to ask you if you'd like to ask any questions or have any comments or have any thoughts. I would be interested to hear what you have to say.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions already. The first question is, what VMware licensing must you have internally to connect?
So there aren't any specific licensing requirements that a customer needs to have on-premise in order to connect to vCHS. So you don't need to have a specific version of the software in order to be able to connect to vCHS at all. You are just, so that's the first, I guess, answer. The second thing is, of course, you don't need any licenses as far as vCHS is concerned, because you are simply purchasing a service from us. So the answer is you don't need any specific licensing level in order to access vCHS.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And we have one more question, which says, so any DCs in APAC?
In Asia Pacific, do we have it? So at the moment, there aren't any. There are plans in Asia Pacific to have a data center in Singapore, a data center in Australia, and a data center in Japan in 2014.
Okay, and we have a few more questions coming in. The next one says, what is stopping one from using, say, Veeam to facilitate the DR?
The problem for Veeam at the moment is that when one's using vCHS, one doesn't have access to vCenter. and part of the reason is that the whole of vCHS is abstracted upper level, so you don't have access to vCenter. So it means that one couldn't run Veeam in vCHS as it stands at the moment. So certainly we are in discussions with Veeam, but that couldn't operate. So one couldn't use Veeam at the moment because of the inability to access vCenter. Veeam do have an offering, a relatively new offering, I think, called vCloud Edition, and we are in discussions with Veeam about vCHS being one of the target points for vCloud Edition. But that vCloud Edition requires our object storage platform, which isn't available till later this year.
Okay, and the next question, are connections made by vCloud connector?
No, well, one can use vCloud connector to connect from on-premises into the vCHS environment, and within vCloud connector, I think there is a simple GUI to allow you to set up the SSL VPN connection into the vCHS environment. So yes, one would use vCloud connector.
Okay, and a question from the same person, so from Jonathan. Are you in talks with Zerto as well?
I don't think we are in talks with Zerto at the moment. Well, certainly not here. There may well be discussions with Zerto in the States, but certainly we're not in discussion. Personally, I'm not in discussions with them here. I'm sure there is dialogue between us in the US. So clearly, Zerto and Veeam are, ISV companies we hear mentioned frequently.
Okay. Just wait a couple more minutes, see if there's any more questions.
I would be interested actually as well for any of the people out there in terms of what they think, as well, whether they think this is a good idea or its value, or indeed whether they think some of the things I've said don't make sense or do make sense. And indeed don't make sense would be I'd be interested to hear as well.
Yep, so if you do have any feedback, just pop it in the critique form that's at the end. So Chris, I think that's all the questions we have for today. Oh, hold on.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, one more just popped up. So this question says, would you need to access to vCenter in the cloud? Maybe that's supposed to say what would you need to access to vCenter in the cloud?
Well, I think this might relate to Veeam, what the Veeam discussion we had before. So, as a general rule, all those software products that require access to vCenter can't be used within vCHS because vCHS doesn't give you access to vCenter. So and that's because vCHS is abstracted upper level, so that because it's really just delivering some resource rather than necessarily delivering the underlying capability. I think there's some issues that if everyone had access to vCenter within vCHS, potentially there'll be more risk of bringing vCHS, potentially bringing it down, I suppose. So one doesn't have access to vCenter. So that's really the kind of key thing for some of those ISV products like Zerto and Veeam. Now, I think going forward there might be some other way forward, accessing APIs and things like that. I'm pretty certain that we're in some of those sorts of discussions with Veeam. I don't know about Zerto, but just to be clear, when one does access vCHS, one gets some resource, but one doesn't get access to vCenter in the traditional way that one may be used to on premises. So I don't know if that's answered that last question or not, but that's the kind of limitation as far as using Veeam is concerned, which I know has come up a number of times. And Veeam, Veeam's done very well for itself. has grown very rapidly and is a good way of copying VMs, a good way of offering kind of backup and recovery of VMs. It copies VMs over, so it's compatible really with the kind of VMware story.
Okay, thank you, Chris, and that is all the questions we have today. So thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar.